This is the London Fintech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London Fintech Podcast, episode 143, brought to you in association with Smart Pension. And I'm delighted to be joined today, once again, by Michael Pearson to discuss fintech financing, performance and valuation. When Michael was last on the show some 18 months ago, I was full of praise for his hardcore, painstaking research into this topic, which contrasts so much with PRE, fluffy, puffy, so-called reports one sees out there. Well, it seems like I'm not the only one who was impressed. His earlier report this year was partnered with KPMG, and another partner of his is Google. You may have heard of both of those. In his recent report, which we will cover in a certain amount of depth, linked to it in the show notes, he now covers almost 100 fintechs and sources his information from Companies House, hence it being very hardcore. Interestingly, off the top of my head, out of these 100 fintechs, there are roughly only 5 that are actually making a profit. He also has some fascinating statistics about the revenue expansion and profit expansion in all the rest. Those of you who have heard of the J-curve, i.e. that you lose more money and you lose money, but then you're going to grow your way out of trouble, may be very interested to hear whether it's J or whether it's indeed another letter when you look at the data. So, without further ado, with credentials and partners like Michael has, there's no need to dive into more detail in the introduction. Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Hi Michael, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Mike. Good to talk to you.
So time flies since we were talking last time, and I always prefer having ideas for other people to do work rather than having ideas myself to do work. And I think I did say to you some 18 months ago when you were looking at, I've forgotten the number of companies now, that 100 was a nice round number. And that's probably quite a nice idea, but it may well be that involved you, and no doubt you thought of it yourself as well, it wasn't just my brilliant idea, that involved you in rather more work. Has this been much harder this time round?
Yeah, it's been time-consuming building up to 100, but once you get to that point, then the process of updating the data is not too difficult. But I remember when I did my first initial piece of analysis, I only had about 20 companies, which I thought was quite interesting. I could sort of draw some insights from that. But everyone told me that 20 was nowhere near enough, that not statistically relevant, etc. So I think, we've got up to 100 companies now. We could go even more than that, but I still think you can get plenty of insights out of that size of sample.
Yes, it's always an interesting thing. People who are too focused on statistics always believe that a larger sample size leads to a smaller error. There is a phenomenon that actually, if you keep increasing your sample size, you are starting to discover a different phenomenon. Which is, if you're looking at the big important fintechs in London, that's that. For the sake of argument, if you expanded it to 1,000, you eat some cheese late at night and have too much red wine, you're having a nightmare, and in your nightmare you're looking at 1,000 companies. The 1,000 companies will be a different business phenomenon from the 100 you're looking at the moment.
Yes, I think the other thing is that the averages that I use in the report give you some indications, some guidelines of what's happening. But actually what's really interesting is looking at the individual cases, because each case arguably is quite different. And that's one of the challenges, of course, trying to get that across in a report, because we can't write detailed case studies on 100 companies. That's probably a bit too time consuming.
Yes, anyway, before we dive into that, and just to maintain the flattery for a change, it is the festive season and approaching Christmas. I genuinely do like what you're doing. You're also, as an indie, like myself, in the business of just trying to find out what's going on and communicating it clearly. You're not spinning anything or trying to sort of sell stories. But in terms of being an indie and doing a bunch of things, you are closely involved in flying to Egypt backwards and forwards quite a lot.
Yes, that's right. I left Lloyd's TSB 13 years ago, and over 13 years ago. And one of the things that I've been doing for the past 10 years is going to Egypt and working with some of the banks there, but also for the last 10 years with a microfinance startup where I was an advisor. Now I'm a non-executive director as well, and we've grown that from nothing in 2009 to a very substantial business in 2019. So it's not a fintech; it's relatively low tech, in fact. But fantastic success story in terms of building a new business in a very challenging marketplace. So I go over there every 3 months, sometimes more often, and always find it fascinating and very interesting.
And I don't know Cairo at all. And everybody I've spoken to always says it's sort of somewhat anarchic, but it's kind of one of those places perhaps that after 10 years you know where to go and all that. I mean, Tokyo is a similar example. Tokyo isn't anarchic, and I suspect that Tokyo is nothing like Cairo in many ways. But it's still a bit forbidding. If you turn up in Tokyo for the first time, as I obviously did a long time ago, you see all these buildings around, you've got no idea where to go in that. But once you've been there many, many times, you find out the places to go and you know people and all that. So is Cairo somewhere that if I just turned up randomly at the airport tomorrow, I'd be completely sort of out of my depth and wondering what's going on? And you get to know better after a decade?
Yes, it's certainly better after a decade. I kind of know where I'm going, although I'm always with a driver or a chaperone, so with my client or someone local. So I'm not really wandering around on my own, sort of trying to find local bars and restaurants, that sort of thing.
Yes, although that has got easier, given that we've just come back from holiday. We went around Southeast Asia and Bangkok and KL and Saigon. The one thing that has changed all around the world is the advent of Google Maps. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant, whether you're looking for, I don't know, tours around the Mekong Delta or coffee shops or restaurants.
Yeah.
From Marrakesh to Mongolia. There's so much information packed in there. Right, okay, so back to your report and your day job. As you say, there's low tech and there's high tech. So as it's a fintech report, I assume that you sort of sat there and you wrote APIs for months, and you just sort of let your APIs run off and crawl all over company's house, and they spit out a report just like that, and while you're making a cup of coffee, and then suddenly you've got a 30-page report? Or is there a bit more sort of string and sellotape and pencil and paper involved?
I'm afraid it's the latter. I'm not capable of writing APIs at the moment.
So how many parameters are you actually sucking out per company? Let's just start with sort of the base data that you're getting out. I mean, let's take, I don't know, Monzo. How many parameters on Monzo do you actually look at?
I don't really count the parameters.
Well, you must look at revenue, for example.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at the key points from the accounts in terms of revenue, if they report their revenues, because some smaller companies don't have to. Monzo does. Profitability, capital expenditure, number of employees, and then all of the items related to equity issuance, which either is from the annual accounts or from registration of share issues that has to take place at Companies House. So if I issue 1,000 shares at a price of £50 a share to my existing shareholders or new shareholders, that has to be registered at Companies House. So all of that information is available. Also the shareholdings of key shareholders. So once a year, companies have to report that in their annual returns. So you can see how many shares the founders have, for example, how many shares corporate investors might have in the company. So you can track all of that over a period of time. Some of the companies on my analysis have been going for 10 years, so that's quite a lot of data. Some of them are just 3 or 4 years old, so it's somewhat less.
So for each company, are you not just looking at this year's data, but let's say it's a 10-year-old company looking at last year's revenue, the year before, the year
Absolutely,
before?
Yeah.
So metaphorically speaking, or maybe even practically, you might have a spreadsheet then, say, of, let's just say, 100 tabs. And on the Monzo tab, you've got 2019 revenue, 2018 revenue, actually not 2019, you're looking at 2018's data, of course.
Yes.
2018, 2017, 2016, so you've got all that data?
Yes.
So that's quite a lot of data then.
It is, yeah.
It must be kind of hard work with a sort of pocket calculator or a spreadsheet.
Well, I'm quite good with Excel spreadsheets, so it's fine.
I was laughing because I was thinking that I've seen so many examples in my career of where it's the spreadsheet that's been the real business revolution. You hear all this stuff about AI and all that kind of stuff, and that's fine. And of course, it does actually happen. But, thinking over the last 20 years, the number of spreadsheets I've seen in the number of organisations where people outside wouldn't imagine. It's been the greatest business tool of our life, apart from the internet.
Well, I started with Lotus 123 about 30 years ago, if you remember that particular software package. But modern day Excel is somewhat more functional than that.
Right. Okay. So you've got 100 tabs in your spreadsheet, as it were, and then in terms of how you're grouping those, for the sake of argument, each tab you've got to do, I don't know, internal rate of return, average compound revenue growth over the last 10 years or something as a stat.
Yeah.
So, the average revenue growth from Monzo, let's say, is 24% per annum or something. And then you've got all these 24s or 27s or minus 56s, and you can add those up and you'll come up with an average revenue growth or something. So the overall statistics of your whole report. So you can say, my company as a whole, they had an average revenue growth of 24% per annum. Do you also do that at a subdivision of fintech level? So, for example, does your report not just look at 100 fintechs in London, but B2Ps or app banks or...
Yes, I'll take a step back on that and say that, first of all, roughly half of the companies in the sample are providing a financial service. So they're providing banking or insurance or payments service. Roughly the other half are providing some sort of technology or processing service, so more what we might call B2B companies. So you can do that split, because I think there'll be some interesting trends developing around that as we progress. And then you have the subsectors, so you have banking tech, lending tech, payment tech, or however you want to describe it, reg tech. The sample sizes in those subsectors are somewhat smaller, obviously, so only around 15 or 16 in each of those subsectors. And then even within that, so in the banking tech sector, as I describe it, you have the digital banks, the ones that have a full banking license, but then you have neobanks, which don't have a banking license but are providing a sort of bank-like service using a prepaid card. So when you start subdividing in that sense, the sample sizes are much smaller. So the digital banks that I cover, for example, would be Monzo, you've mentioned, Starling, Tandem, Atom, Revolut, which has a banking license but is not quite the same as the others. So quite small sample sizes when you get down to that level.
Okay, well, let's start with the big picture, which is the very simple one for us all to understand, of profit. And if I remember it roughly right, then out of your 100, you say that 5 are making a profit, which is not necessarily that many. Which are the 5, by the way?
The 5 are Oak North, TransferWise, iWalker, ClearScore, and LendInvest, each quite different companies. Some of them relatively young, in the sense that they're only maybe 3 or 4 years old, like Oak North or ClearScore, and they've moved to profitability quite quickly. TransferWise and iWalker are more of the original fintechs from 2010, 2011, and they've taken longer to get to profitability, get to scale, but they are profitable after 6 or 7 years.
And this is probably an unfair question, but it's always the way that looking at numbers makes you wonder what the underlying phenomena are. And as you say, you've got the actual, we're only talking about a handful of names here. What's your feel, well, let's say feel, rather than necessarily what you've sort of written in black and white in a report. What's your feel of what it is perhaps the ones seeing the data or these 5 companies are doing, which means they're in profit? And please don't reply that their revenues are higher than their expenses, which is the secret. Or you can if you want.
I wish I could give you a simple answer to that. People would say, obviously, that management teams are very important. And so some people would say, well, you need to have a management team who are experienced in the industry to which they're moving into. But that's not the case for Oak North or TransferWise, for example. So they were relatively young teams with very little experience in financial services, but actually have done extremely well. LendInvest and ClearScore and iWalker, the management teams there did have much more experience in.
Yeah, I mean, Christian at Lendinvest was doing London property well before Fintech existed in a different format.
Yeah. One of the founders of ClearScore was one of the founders of Capital One, Nigel Morris. I mean, fantastic track record, so clearly knew what he was doing.
The good news for those people in the audience that don't have experience of areas is just a simple takeaway from that, which is that, yes, of course, if you really know what you're doing in an area, that can be very helpful, but actually that isn't a necessary or sufficient criterion for success, because actually it may well be that if you don't, but you, quotes, do the right thing, then...
Yeah, I think these companies, it may be hard to compare with what's happening with the digital banks at the moment, the Monzos, the Revoluts and the Starlings and so on, which are raising very large amounts of money at a very young age, some of them with global expansion plans.
I think Revolut's has got galactic by now, hasn't it?
Yeah, so it's on a mission to Mars already. Which puts an awful lot of strain on the companies in terms of recruiting the right people, putting in place the processes and systems, and you can see some of that creaking in the regulatory side of things and compliance side of things for those companies. Whereas, it seems like TransferWise and iWalker, for example, the ones that I mentioned have been around since 2010, 2011, so they were early pioneers. They seem to have had a much more stable, slow, relatively minimal losses. They did incur losses over their first 5 or 6 years, but relatively sort of modest in relation to how they were building the companies, compared to what we're seeing with some of the fintechs now, like the digital banks, where it seems to be a case of raising a lot of money very quickly and going international very quickly, perhaps before all of the foundations are in place fully.
Yes. We'll end up with the bigger picture tech thing. Whilst I was on holiday, WeWork had some interesting experiences. I was quite amazed when I came back to see what had happened with their potential float. I hope someday somebody sacks me from the London Fintech podcast and I walk away with over $1 billion as a price for failure. But sticking with the revenue growth, so we've discussed those firms. At an aggregate level, people can look at your report in the more detailed level if they're interested. In terms of, for the sake of argument, the 95 who aren't making profit, is there an overall pattern in the trend there? And I know it's complex data, but are the losses reducing? Is there a J curve? Are these firms as a whole or in the various sectors getting nearer to profitability? Or is it, I don't know what the letter is, an S or something? Is it going off the edge of the cliff?
Yeah, so in fact, for the whole sample, 85% of the companies reported increasing losses in their latest financial year. But more concerning slightly is that for those companies that were more than 5 years old, 78% of those companies were reporting increasing losses. So there's relatively little indication overall in the sample that as you go getting into years 6, 7, 8, that things are getting much better. So that's a bit of a concern.
Yes, I think going back to J curves or whatever it was, going back to decades ago, Lotus 1, 2, 3s and things like that, I think I must have had it about 30 years ago or something like that. And I think the vast majority of times in my career that I've heard this phenomenon, which is, oh yes, things are getting worse, but they're going to turn around. It doesn't.
Yeah. Well, we have to remember these are all startup venture-funded companies, and we shouldn't expect them all to be successful. There's one example I could mention, which I won't mention the name because I don't really want to pick on them, but in its 8th year of reporting, and this is a company that was highlighted by many people as a disruptive influence and a great example of fintech. In its 8th year of operation, its revenues are £6 million, and it's losing nearly £5 million. Now, that's after 8 years, and the revenue growth in that 8th year was only 24% over the previous year. So it's not even growing that fast anymore. So, this is a nice little company, perhaps. It may get to break even, but this is not transforming the financial services industry.
Yes, it's a point that's well made. And thinking about this, I think there's a strong argument. I mean, if I had sort of 1 second to save the world, and God said you've got 1 second to press the yes or no button, and if you're wrong, the world disappears. And the question he put to me with my 1 second to snap a button was, are these independent fintechs the digital as applied to new firms being created and doing new services for individuals and things, as opposed to Citigroup is going to change things because of digital. That is it akin to the dot-com bubble, then I think I would immediately press yes, give them 1 second, without any, just it's got to be yes or no, insofar as behind all of the hype and the million media articles and VC industry pushing it all, because they wouldn't they? I mean, it's their investments. They want to get the maximum publicity of the investments. The reality is, and this is not rare for any new boom, the reality is that the vast majority of this phenomenon that we've been talking about on the show the last few years is not going to make it. There will be, perhaps, the Revoluts who have gone galactic, and Nick, despite all of the flack that's come his way on many dimensions, he may succeed or something like that. But at a certain point in time, if I was, for example, a pension fund looking at my allocations between bonds, equities, cash, VC, I wouldn't be looking at increasing my VC commitment in this area. I'd be saying, well, do you know what? Let's say you'd flogged me some fund 5 years ago. Yes, good to see you, Michael. Well, it was worth a gamble, and I think some of your investments may still come off and it'll be worthwhile, but I can't actually see the argument now for putting any new funds into independent fintechs in the UK in the next few years. Would that be fair or unfair?
I'm sure that there's a lot to be learnt from the last 10 years of fintech investing, and it may be that VCs can target their investments in a different way to find the sweet spots, because there is a lot of transformation that's required in financial services, in technology, and it's finding the companies that can make that happen. But would you invest in another digital bank, for example, where there are already a number of digital banks which are fighting for new customers with the established banks, where you know that you're going to have to lose 50 to 100 million over the first few years just to get to sort of first base? Would you want to do that as an investor at this point? Probably not. But there will be niches within the fintech space where there might be some, there are going to be some opportunities.
Yes, and to your point, you remind me of an anecdote I shall share, which is a founder who I respect, who has been in fintech for, should we say, 5 to 10 years. I said to them a little while ago, if I wipe out your business tomorrow, I'll give you a bit of money as a result, and I say, go and do it all over again. Go and start next week, all over again. Given what you've learnt over the last 5 to 10 years, what would you do? And this individual's response, it's an individual, so different people would differ, but he's been at the heart of this phenomenon. Their response was, I've learnt a lot from X. He mentioned the name of another fintech. And next time around, I wouldn't look to do any of this disruption stuff or fintechy stuff. He said, I would look to form a good business that I thought could be profitable. So a lot of fintech foundation was, we're going to disrupt the industry, we're going to change it, all this excitement, we can do these new business models and all that kind of stuff. But for this founder, he would approach it next time round in the way, let's forget fintech completely, in the way that you and I might approach founding a new business next year. Is there a space to create a business doing X that actually, X is going to be profitable, is going to make a money? The old-fashioned way of doing business.
Yeah.
Which is that you give me a call in January and say, hey, Mike, do you want to do a business? Let me know what it is. What is it? It's this and this, and we're going to lose money for 5 years. No, thank you. Or I've got this business here. Actually, I know these people. There's a gap in this industry in plumbing or whatever. And we're making a profit within the first 15 months, and then we'll grow it. But cut a long story short, he's basically saying, forget all the hype, forget all the techie stuff. I would just go back to old-fashioned business principles. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, somebody would create a business if they saw a gap in the market and they could see that it was profitable, as opposed to this kind of speculatively, which is like hitting a golf ball into the dark and hoping it lands on the green or something.
It's difficult. I mean, peer-to-peer lending or marketplace lending was supposed to be a disruptive business model, and certainly the peer-to-peer platforms in aggregate, whether on the consumer side or the SME side, have generated a lot of business over the last 7 or 8 years. So some of them have reached quite a reasonable scale, like Funding Circle. But Funding Circle has struggled since its IPO. Its share price is down 75%. The company is valued at less now in market capitalization terms than the total amount of equity that's been invested in the company since it started. It's still losing a lot of money, and that's after 9 years. So you think, well, maybe the business model is not actually a viable business model. There's not enough margin there, because just doubling the size of the business is not going to wipe that loss out. So, but on the other hand, iWalker, which is in the same kind of space, has managed to get to profitability. So maybe there are some ways of doing it.
Similar space, but iWalker is just a direct lender. So he doesn't have to raise all the funds or something. He just gets a sort of bunch of money from funders and then goes and just lends it. Almost a fund manager in the debt market, you might say.
Yeah, and that's the key. I mean, there are subtle differences in these business models where if you brand everything as a marketplace lender or as a peer-to-peer lender, you'll find under the surface that there are differences, and it may be that those differences are sufficient to make one business work and one business not work. So, Oak North, for example, also doing SME lending, but would say it's in a very different segment of the market and has a different business model to a Funding Circle or an iWalker.
Yes, that's a point well made. So what I take away from that is beware generalizations like P2P is good or P2P is bad, or it's disruptive, or it's not disruptive. I mean, LendInvest is not technically a peer-to-peer now under the regulation, but let's forget all the sort of technically stuff. They are making a profit. iWalker are making a profit. So it is possible to create a business which is making a profit by lending money. Let's forget how it lends the money. But the Funding Circle, I haven't followed that in detail recently, but it seems fairly catastrophic. In the context, let's zoom up from that one actually, because I think it's a very big picture context. Zooming up to the big picture, WeWork is a very special example, and it's a bit of a one-off, so let's not worry too much about WeWork, but there have been a number of techs as a whole, so we'll zoom up from fintechs to techs, and we'll zoom up to the American markets that have IPO'd. I can't remember them all. You probably can. You haven't been on holiday recently for weeks and weeks and forgotten about everything, where they've kind of grown and grown and grown, and we've got losses, but we don't worry about that. That's old hat. And here we are in the market. We're going to go great. And they managed to sort of the capital funders managed to punt it out to the market, get their money back, and the thing tanks.
Yeah, I don't have the full list of those, but I mean, Uber is another famous one where they're struggling to get the core business model to be profitable, whilst expanding in a whole range of different countries and also different market segments, and they're fighting fires on just about every front. In financial services, I mean, there are some good cases. So Square, which IPO'd a few years ago, has been doing very well with its payment processing. More recently in Europe, Adyen, which is a payments processor in the Netherlands, IPO'd and has been doing very well. And it's, again, a small sample, but and there have been a couple of acquisitions of payment processors as well, startup payment processors. I mean, there appears to be something in the payment processing space which Fintechs have been able to target, names that most of us will never have heard of because you don't see them as consumers.
As always, it's the unglamorous businesses that are the
doing something
ones
behind the scenes.
Yes, exactly,
in this horribly complicated payment processing world that we live in. But you might note that I haven't checked recently, but in the last 5 or 6 years, despite of all this disruption that's going on, Visa's market capitalization just continues to grow. I mean, Visa is doing extremely well out of all of these changes that are taking place. And this is an old-style incumbent with some very, very old technology.
I think my takeaway from that is that, coming back to this point about it's the unsexy ones that you and I haven't heard of, or that you and I, who knew quite a bit about this world, we see something in the newspaper and go, who are they? Didn't know who they were, and they're suddenly sort of, floating for a fortune somewhere, which is that the unsexy parts of the industry are not the one where there's a sort of feeding frenzy, unlike the sort of the sexier, foreign exchange or app banks or peer.
And that may end up being a parallel to the dot-com boom, where in fact a lot of the the core technologies that were being developed for the internet back in 1999 and so on produced companies like Cisco and and other companies that provided the infrastructure for the internet and ended up being very successful.
Yes, I think I buy that. Okay, so look, we've kicked quite a few things round. It's clearly a challenging time for the industry, or to look at it a different way, it's a point in time where we start to see the sheep being separated from the goats. In a way, it sounds very silly, but in a way, 0 is a very arbitrary number, quotes, unquotes. So somebody can make £1 and appear to be making a profit, and someone can lose £1 and appear to be making a loss. But I think more concerning is that for your sample as a whole, the ones making a loss, the losses are increasing, especially in particular for those who've been going around for some time. I mean, if I formed a business last year and its losses have gone up, so be it. But frankly, if I've been there for 5 or 10 years, I really ought to be sort of pulling the joystick up and stopping approaching the ground at a rate of knots. So things are clarifying. Good. Okay, well, I recommend people go and check the report out. It doesn't take very long. It is unhypey, and in the same way that I hope I communicate to the audience what things are actually like, how they are, without any sort of media spin or VC spin or anything like that. You've got the base data there, and people can draw their own detailed conclusions from it. Before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank the listeners out there, my brand partner for the podcast, Smart Pension, who are fast, secure and free. Check out their UK workplace pensions at autoenrollment.co.uk. So, Michael, you're less of a large firm yourself and more of an indie like myself. So what flags do you want to wave? You've got a report which we've mentioned once or twice, and people can check out. And how do people get that easily?
Go to the website, my website, which is clarusinvestments.com.
That's CLARUS investments.com.
That's right. It's very straightforward. Or email me at michael@clarusinvestments.com, and that's I can send you some more information. The full report was published with KPMG and Google back in April, May earlier this year. What we've been talking about today is an interim update, so there isn't a full report based on this, but I can send you some information if you get in touch with me.
Excellent. And in terms of when you're not sitting over your pencil and paper and your old copy of Lotus 1, 2, 3, compiling all these numbers, what kind of services do you offer firms who are interested in this whole fintech space in terms of consulting and helping them work through, for the sake of argument, their investment strategy? I mean, I'm sure that if I was investing in fintech, I'd love to have you come along and talk to my firm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I provide consulting services in financial services generally. My specialization is around strategy and innovation, and fintech is just part of that, actually.
And you're happy to work in countries other than Egypt?
Happy to work wherever. And I also produce thought leadership research, which, as I mentioned before, was recently done with KPMG and Google. But I'm also working with companies like Infosys on thought leadership. So, please get in touch with me about that if you're interested.
Excellent. Well, as it is now turned December, I wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Maybe the first person to do that, and I wish that to my listeners as well. 2019 is busily running out. I think one reason I've lost the plot is that I'm busy avoiding all media whatsoever because of this election campaign. I've heard more than enough politics the last 2 or 3 years to last the rest of my life. Anyway, fairly soon that will be over and done with one way or another. So thank you for that, Michael, and I wish you all the best in 2020.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you have consulting, advisory/non-exec or media needs in the FS or fintech space, get in touch with me at mike@londonfintechpodcast.com.
We could sit in a bend there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moonrise, watching a happy moonrise. Come away from the city, the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? And we fade in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me, 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 watch the firelight